So good morning. I'm George Brenkert, Professor Emeritus at Georgetown University.
And you were formerly editor.
Uh, yes, formerly editor of Business Ethics Quarterly, and a number of other things we might talk about as we get into the interview.
Good, great. So how did you get into business ethics?
Well, the one course I knew that I wanted to take in college when I was in high school was a course in ethics. I had been part of a youth group that brought together a number of high schools in Denver, and we studied materials on international politics, national politics, and we had a Sunday morning radio program, and we talked about them. They usually had a policy or an ethics dimension, so I wanted to take ethics at college, and I did, and majored in philosophy. Found it fascinating, went to India, spent a couple of years there, supposedly and nominally teaching English, but since the students were generally on strike, you had a lot of time to read Indian philosophy and religion and Western philosophy and religion and literature, and got into the study more of Marxism, and even Soviet Marxism at that time, and decided I needed to come back for a Ph.D. in philosophy in the United States. And as I moved through that program, I became interested in more naturalistic approaches to ethics. So my dissertation had to do with questions of prudence. And so I easily came into the way of thinking about things that, well, what is the most important institution in life today? And that's really basically business as far as I'm concerned. And so having studied Marxism in India, Marx being one of the great business ethics philosophers, it was interesting to bring that together with my study of ethics at the university. Part of looking at Marx had to do with alienation, and I thought that was maybe a naturalistic way we could approach, sort of tie in ethical questions into naturalistic issues, into how people viewed themselves, and basically in some forms of human nature. So I started working on Marx, and then once you work on Marx, you're really basically moving into business ethics, especially if you have a business ethics background. So you can say that I got into business ethics because of my initial interest in ethics, and I would add that when I was in graduate school, this was during the time of the Vietnam War. And so there was a big emphasis on practicality of philosophy and various disciplines. What is the practical effects? So my interest in ethics, doing this during the Vietnam War, in which the emphasis was on practicality and how people were supposed to apply what they were learning, tying in with the interest in the naturalistic approaches to ethics, and then looking at the major institution in the world, in the United States, being business, and then it was easy to get into business ethics from there. So you might say this interest in ethics, my naturalistic approach, Marxism, all brought me to business ethics.
And you taught it first where? You taught it first, or you wrote on it first? How did you?
I taught it first, I think, as a distinct course at the University of Tennessee. I started writing on it at the University of Minnesota Duluth. I think my first paper on Marx's view of alienation I did at University of Minnesota Duluth. So I started there, but then at Tennessee developed a course in business ethics and started going to various societies. That was just the point when the Society for Business Ethics was just getting started. Went to one of Norman Boy's earliest conferences in business ethics. Went to, I think, the second conference in business ethics that Mike Hoffman had. Was at maybe the second or so meeting of people interested in the American Philosophical Association, interested in business ethics and creating a society for business ethics. So right at the outset, I was there looking at business ethics issues in the context of going to different kinds of conferences and the formation of the Society for Business Ethics.
Did you start your career in University of Minnesota Duluth?
Right, yeah.
So where did you go to graduate school?
Went to the University of Michigan. I'd been to Colgate University, and they had a really wonderful philosophy department there, excellent people in ethics and history of philosophy, and their recommendations got me into the University of Michigan, which was one of the top philosophy departments at that time. Had wonderful instructors there. William Frankena, Bill Frankena was my Ph.D. advisor. He was outstanding and well-known American ethicists at that time. Richard Brandt was there, well known for his work in utilitarianism. Charles Stevenson was there, who was known for his work in metaethics and emotivism. So we had three of the top ethicists in the country at Michigan at that time. We had also people who were interested in social and political issues. This was the time at Michigan when the Peace Corps was founded. This was the time when students were having demonstrations with regard to what was going on in Vietnam and other parts of the United States. So it was really an active area, lots of intellectually interesting things going on, and attempts to relate them to what was going on in society. So it was a fantastic time to be there. But it was also a time it was extremely difficult to come out and get a job in the job market. So I, as many other people, went through the rigors and the turmoil of trying to find a job, found a lovely department at the University of Minnesota Duluth, very compatible department. But I only spent 2 years there until the University of Tennessee said they wanted somebody, and they were interested in somebody who was specializing more in social and political philosophy, and Marxism was part of that, and so I was very happy to go to Tennessee.
Yeah, warmer.
You know what?
It's warmer in Tennessee.
It's much warmer in Tennessee, much warmer in Tennessee.
So, and so then you began writing, and so what did you expect this focus on business ethics? What sort of career, did you have any career goals or any writing goals or?
Well, I think my first intention was simply to learn more about, for myself, and develop my own thoughts with regard to social and political philosophy, with regard to business ethics, with regard to Marxism. So it was more a kind of self-development myself, see what I could create that other people would be willing to recognize, would be willing to publish, and then get to know other people who are working in similar fields, and get to know them through conferences and through sharing my papers with them. So my goals were fairly limited, and coming out as an assistant professor, the goals that many of us have is, well, are you going to get tenure? How are you going to get tenure? And so the importance of publishing was quite important. I think only after I became tenured did my goals expand more, because then I got into more things with regard to what was going on in the department. I eventually became chair of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Tennessee for half a dozen years or so. And it was after that then I became much more involved in the Society for Business Ethics, API, the American Association of Professional Ethics, and I spent a number of conferences at SIM, as well as other professional groups going to their conferences. So it was sort of a slow development, how I expanded my interests. And then as that moved along, and I had other kinds of responsible positions, and I then moved to Georgetown. They called me up and wanted somebody in business ethics. And Washington, D.C. was a place that we had always found fascinating to go to. And so we were delighted to go to Georgetown and Washington, D.C. And at that point, then I was chair of, or director of, a Center for Business Ethics at Georgetown. So it got me looking more broadly at what was going on. At that point, Norm Bowie and Pat Werhane had approached me at an SBE meeting and said, well, how about thinking about being editor of Business Ethics Quarterly, a memorable SBE meeting that I went to. And I was delighted to do that, and that was a wonderful opportunity. I think it was a chance for me to do some things, build on what Pat had done. Pat had done it for 10 years and built up a tremendous journal. I think I built upon that in trying to expand its recognition by various citation services, by developing area editors, by bringing other people into the various positions with regard to the editing of the journal. And I think I left it a better journal after I had completed. I also found the subsequent editor, Gary Weaver, who did an outstanding job as well. So it's always nice when you leave a position that you leave in a better position than when you arrived at it, and then you find a capable and successor that you really would like to hand it to. It was at that time also my goals and aspirations, you might say, expanded a bit more, together with Laszlo Zolnai from the University of Budapest, whom I invited to Georgetown for a semester. He and I came up with the idea of creating a Transatlantic Business Ethics Institute, or a conference, I should say. And so the idea of that was to bring together 10 business ethicists from North America and 10 business ethicists from Europe every 2 years. And so we had our first conference in Budapest, which was a lovely conference, and then a conference after that in Washington, D.C. And after that, we have been all over Europe. We've been to Barcelona. We have been to Milan in the United States. We've been to Philadelphia, Wharton. We've been to Notre Dame. So we've been to a wide variety of very interesting places with wonderful people. That organization is still going strong now after 20 years, so I feel quite good about that organization, that I had a initial role in helping to create that organization take place. I still play a role in identifying people who will serve as hosts of that organization and looking at the programs that they've developed. At the same time, coming back from a conference, I don't know if it was a Society of Business Ethics conference, but I'd been at a conference which there were some ethics officers from various major corporations. And I talked with several of them and came up with the idea of creating a capital area business ethics network. And 5 of us got together at Georgetown way back about 15 or so years ago and came up with the idea of creating an organization composed mainly of ethics officers of major corporations, of Lockheed, of Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and the like, as well as, it turned out we added ethics officers from government positions, as well as from NGOs, Catholic Charities, and the like. And we meet quarterly and have a presentation or a panel presentation of issues of interest to ethics officers. And so I shepherded that down its course and its development for about 10 years and thought, okay, well, that was enough. We created a constitution and bylaws and identified successors. And so that organization is going on very nicely as well. 15 years later, I just went to a nice panel discussion of business ethics at Northrop Grumman. So it's been nice to have that interface with people in dealing with ethics and compliance at major corporations and other major organizations that are not based or that are present in the DC area, even though they have an international as well as a national presence. And so it's been a slowly developing process in which take little steps and bigger steps and have greater aspirations. It's been a wonderful ride. It's been a wonderful ride.
So do you have future research you're working on now?
Doing 2 things. One, an administrative role in which I help identify people for Georgetown University Learning Community classes. That's taking a great deal of my time, but I'm trying to keep also my research agenda active, and that has involved most recently looking at trying to identify what I would like to call a kind of normative dynamic of business that leads to various ethical issues, ethical problems, ethical misdeeds that take place in business, at least as they are viewed from outside of business. And then see how I can match that with an ethical theory that is not simply the ethical theory of everyday life that is applied without alteration or without any kind of different changes to business, but takes into account special characteristics of business. That I've been working on for the past couple of years. Is still a work in progress, we might say, but I find it fascinating. What I find fascinating about it is that I think one of the things that we haven't really adequately dealt with is the messy nature of ethics and morality. I think many times it's viewed, well, we have a simple type of guideline, or people in business have a simple guideline. Would you be willing to tell your mother? Would you be willing to see it in the front page of the New York Times? Well, that's not going to work very well. But I think the messiness, the dirty hands questions that arise, the tragic kinds of issues that people face, the dilemmas they face, we haven't given sufficient attention to. And so looking at this normative dynamic of business, I'd like to bring in this other view of morality that I've been working on, trying to develop for myself, at the same time putting it, and this is the 3rd dimension of this project, so that's why it's a large project taking longer than I would like. The 3rd dimension is putting this all in a much more social and political context. Here you might say my background in political philosophy and Marx is coming back to the fore, because I think in some sense it's clear that businesses are political organizations, that ethics has a strong political side. If you go back to Aristotle, his ethics was part of the politics. And so I'd like to bring these three different aspects of my interests and my research together and crystallize them in some way that I find persuasive, then I can persuade other people that it's also persuasive. So that's where I'm going in my current research.
That's great. So, and how do you see, what questions are we facing today that we perhaps didn't think about very much when we began thinking about business ethics?
Well, I think the questions we haven't thought sufficiently about relate to the types of issues I was just mentioning with regard to the messiness of philosophy and the social and political dimensions. I think the whole role of power in society, the role of power with regard internally in organizations, and the role of power that business organizations exercise in society, I don't think business ethicists have come to terms with that sufficiently. They have been concerned many times with the internal dynamics in businesses, and there are lots of power questions going on there as well as ethical dimensions. I think that's been given much greater treatment than the external dimensions, at least to my way of thinking, that that's the case. And so I'd like to see us explore much more the notions of power in business. Stephen Lukes has a classic book years and years ago in which he talks about three different kinds of power. And I think we need to explore those dimensions of power and how people use them both to the advantage of people in society outside of business and to the disadvantage of people outside of businesses. So that's where my own work is headed, and that's where I think business ethics needs to head more in the future. We'll see how it goes.
See how it goes. Yeah, see how, so what do you see, what do you think about the future of the profession? We say business ethics, if it is a profession, I don't know, but the future of the society in the future, where do you think it's going, or is it just going to stay like the same?
That's yes. I don't have my my
Stargazer
role in going at present. Well, I've been impressed with the development of society business over the past years. The expansion of it, the internationalization of the Society of Business Ethics, it's clear to me that that's going to continue. We have at the conference this year in Boston an interesting mixture of people from outside the United States. Some of those are emerging scholars. Other of those are scholars who have come in from outside the United States. I think that that's clearly going to develop much further than it has in the past. I think many of the assumptions that I hear when people talk about business ethics that at this conference reflect quite often American assumptions and biases. I think it'll be interesting the extent that we can further identify those and no longer be sort of held hostage to those and recognize those for kinds of biases that, and they're not, to say it's a bias isn't necessarily to say it's something bad. It's just an assumption that we have, and we maybe don't recognize that, and that it may not apply in other situations, or other people aren't experiencing ethical issues in the same way in which we are. And so I think that will be an interesting area in which I see the Society for Business Ethics developing further in terms of the kind of research that people do there, in bringing in people from other parts of the United States and around the world. That is playing a significant role. When I talk to people in Europe, it's been in India when I was there. I've been outside advisors of Ph.D.s, dissertations in India. And the amount that they were drawing upon American or Anglo-American research in business ethics was quite striking. Of course, my response to them is, well, that's really nice that you're drawing upon American resources, but you've got a lot of resources here in India. You should perhaps try to integrate that into your dissertation as well. And so the attempt to bring the issues of business ethics to people in their own context, to enable them, to encourage them to develop business ethics within those own contexts of which they grew up and developed is important, which isn't to say that I don't think that those contexts may not be subject to important criticism, as well as those here in the United States. And so I would like to see us to become much more self-reflective about these types of issues as we go forward.
Great. Gretchen has arrived. Do you have any questions?
Gretchen has arrived, and quietly so.
Good, I'm glad. I have a question for you, George, and I was listening to you talk about your relationship with the different businesses, with the Capital Area Network and so on. So I'm curious, as you look back and reflect, has the engagement of academics with business resulted in any significant impact on the business community or individuals within the business community? Are there any companies that have really embraced this effectively so that you see different kinds of decisions happening or being made in a business context?
I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that question, because I think in part to answer that question, I'd have to have more access to actually the internal decisions people are making in business as they lie behind the actions and policies they engage in. Clearly not, our work at the Capillary Business Ethics Network, I think, has been very supportive of the ethics and compliance work of ethics officers. And they've been able to share concerns, they've been able to share any number of practical suggestions and technical suggestions how they can implement their programs better. I think the implications and the impact on business ethics in businesses started way back, as Richard DeGeorge mentioned yesterday, with regard to federal sentencing guidelines and the development of the federal sentencing guidelines and other kinds of legislation that's gone on. So I think an important part has clearly been played by legislation in encouraging businesses to develop ethics or compliance programs, and generally they're compliance programs. The ethics is for a person from a background in ethics is much less in the fore than the compliance. But that's not bad. If they comply, I'm happy with that to a great extent. But the differences within the business can be quite striking. At Lockheed Martin, they had a very active ethics program, or still have, as far as I know, a very active ethics program. They encourage people to create their own videos with regard to ethics situations that they would show to other employees. And so they are quite imaginative, I think, in trying to develop an ethics sense within the organization of how people ought to go about acting in different kinds of ways. The problem is people get put in different types of situations in which the pressures are so great, it overcomes those ethical qualms they might have. And then the question is, how can businesses remove those threats, those pressures that lead people to act in these types of ways? There was a good example of one business, I won't mention its name, in which the chief financial officer had requested a statement from his subordinates with regard to their the economics of their finances and where the profitability and the like, and they came up with the results, and he said, no, those results that can't be. And so the people under him said, well, this guy's brilliant, so he must know something we don't know. So they went back and ran the numbers again. He said, what we told you the first time was correct. He said, no, that's got to be incorrect. And so they went back, and then they figured out a way so they could jimmy the accounting for that year to make things match up the way he wanted it. And then once they'd done it one year, they had to do it the next year. That business no longer exists. It was a transnational business. So it's those types of pressures that people have difficulty standing up to. Their reputation is on the line. Their income is on the line. There's huge amounts of pressures on people because this one person in an important role who exercised a great deal of power over these people was able to encourage them and to, in effect, coerce them to come up with the results that he wanted, which were not the results that were good for that business. So it's those types of things going on in businesses that I don't have that much privy to, but which I can see in cases such as Lockheed Martin I have seen that I think, yeah, they're making some really serious efforts to improve the ethical awareness of people, ethical newsletters, ethical minute or whatever else that we'll have. Well, ethical minute, I'm not sure how much that's going to help, but I think they're trying to raise the awareness of people in business. But it's the whole social dimension, the economic dimension that people are operating within that I think leads them to do things that we don't think they ought to be doing, that I don't see that we have come to terms with.
George, can you expand a little bit on this power idea that you were talking about? Is it perceived power, actual power, power of position? You talk about the power of organizations in society. Can you just expand on what you mean when you say?
Well, I think power is exercised in different kinds of ways. Power is exercised in one sense in terms of direct commands and people being punished if they don't do certain types of things. Power can be exercised by not inviting people to meetings, excluding people from meetings, so they don't know what's going on, so they're marginalized. Power is exercised in that way. Power is exercised by setting the agenda of meetings so certain types of issues don't come up. So different levels and different kinds and different gradations of power that you can see going on in an organization. And if you think of power simply as sort of the strong arm type of thing, you're missing the other kinds of more subtle forms of power that we exercise over people through herd mentality, through peer pressure, through a wide variety of ways in which we are affected by those people around us and those people to whom we are supposed to report, those people who have authority over us. There's just a whole set of subtle dimensions that I think we need to explore, those that get people to do things that they might not otherwise do or would not otherwise do, but they feel that they have to do it because this person has required them to do it, because they've been excluded from the meeting, they haven't had a say, they didn't feel they could speak up in the meeting, the issue they wanted to talk was not allowed to be on the agenda. Those are all ways that I think we need to explore how power is exercised over people within organizations.
Can I ask you a question about power then societally?
Yeah.
You touched on it about the progression as we're going on towards a vanishing point of certain jobs and occupations, etc.
Yeah.
A Marxist analysis can explain perhaps concentration of ownerships or control of means of productions, but does it have any analysis for the loss of complete areas of labour and what the alienation will be of the previous workforce to that, what humanity's going to do when it's got all this free time?
Well, I think there are a lot of speculations of what Marx might have said about that. I think clearly if you look at what's going on in society in terms of maybe a Marxist background, or I'm inclined to, I hate labels in some sense, especially in the United States. Labels are dangerous. Okay, socialism is thrown around as a dangerous kind of label. Communism is thrown around as a dangerous kind of label. Marxism, okay, well then this is dangerous. So I hate the label type of thing. But I think in terms of looking at the dynamics of how society operates, the power that corporations operate in society, their ability to help write laws, their ability of not simply corporations, I'm talking also about NGOs, to get certain people to be elected in certain kinds of districts. There's a huge, important power dynamic, and I think you could say also a class dynamic that's going on with regard to those types of issues, not only with regard to economics, but also now with regard to race, perhaps with gender as well. So there's just a huge set of dimensions. Some of those issues are starting to be raised more with the Society of Business Ethics. We've had some of that in the last day or so here at the Society for Business Ethics. But I think a greater attention to that and how this works out in terms of the directions in which our society is going and other societies are going. I mean, it's greatly concerning in our society how the effects of the pharmaceutical businesses, as well as the leveraged bio companies, okay, the venture capital companies, have had effects on society. There's a marvelous book called The Glass House that details the impact that venture capital firms have had in a small town or not so small town in Ohio, in which they would come in and buy up the firm, strip of its resources, sell them off, fire thousands of people, and the people fell into drug use, and it destroyed that community. Okay, so there you can certainly talk about, if you want to talk about a Marxist aspect to it, you could talk about it there. I don't know if we need to use that term. I mean, we have all we need to do is talking about the effects on people, the power these companies have exercised over this community without their having any say in what was going on, and the effects that then resulted because of the drugs, the opioids and the like, that they were made accessible to them, to gross numbers in some of the pharmacies in those particular communities. So I think we can do all we need to do without talking particularly about Marxism, we have the tools, I think, we can look at in terms of the effect on particular classes, the effect on particular segments in our society, the effect of these businesses and organizations and Wall Street firms on daily life of people and the loss of jobs. On the other hand, I think we also have to recognize this is a global economy, okay? And so if firms can manufacture or produce things more cheaply otherwise, it is to the advantage of their consumers that they produce those goods more cheaply. On the other hand, then the role of society kicks in. Well, how are we going to protect these workers? How are we going to create jobs? I mean, the fact that the education system in the United States is so weak, I think, in terms of people getting good educations, of having good job prospects. And I think that's a social dimension of society that our society fails. And I think the individualism that we have in our society, which is really admirable, has a dark side. And the dark side is the effect on people having to do it for themselves in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of any number of types of things. I think that has been really badly affected our society. It's had great consequences in other aspects, but I think it's had some downsides that we have yet to come to terms with. And I would hope that as we move forward in this society in the future, that we are able to turn the corner on those. What I worry about is that you see similar types of movements in other countries around the world these days that are having bad effects on their society. So I don't know how much hope I have at this point. I guess you could say I have hope, but I'm not quite sure how well we're going to go to where I would like to see us go.
But just to backtrack a bit, would you say that, because you said Marx was one of the first people in business ethics, so he sort of sets that, does he set that stage? So that's why we worry about workers' rights, and we may not use the word alienation,
Yeah.
but although I think it's a pretty good word.
Oh, it is.
But that and the worries about people being laid off and all of those kinds of issues. Would you say I'm trying to put words in your mouth, but it seems to me that Marx was the instigator of that and raised those issues, and so. You have to face him. If you
Yeah.
don't, doesn't matter if you read Marx.
Yeah.
He's right there with a needle in us, poking us to say.
Well, it's not simply Marx is raised these issues. At the time of Marx, there were the utopian socialists and other kinds of socialists. There were people having ideal communities here in the United States and in Great Britain. So there's, I think, in the 19th century, because of the industrialization, a great deal of concern was raised, at least by some people, both intellectuals and some people actually in business, about the effect that the industrialization was having on people in British society and other societies around the world. So that's why, again, I don't think we have to simply point at Marx. We have lots of other tools and other people we can look at. But I think business ethics, not using the word itself, or the term itself got started then. I think that started much later. But the thrust of it, the concerns that business ethics attempts to capture, got started back then. Of course, you know, given your own work in Adam Smith, you would have to go back to Adam Smith and look at some of the things that he did both in ethics and the wealth of nations, and you could go back even that far to look at his views of how businesses operate, or people operate when they get together, and the effect on people in society. He recognized some of these problems of pin factory labor and the like. So it was a slowly developing type of thing, which is not surprising, I suspect, that has developed since the time of Adam Smith. It certainly got a big shot in the 19th century. In the early 20th century, I think it, because of the preoccupation with World War I and then the Depression and then World War II, these types of things fell away somewhat, but then after World War II, I think there was a huge development began with regard to how we view our intellectual labors and the practical nature of those intellectual labors, and that's when it was a ripe moment for business ethics to get started at that point in name, and that's when business ethics got started in that particular name. It wasn't simply society, business and society, which could include any number of types of topics, but business ethics got started then. And I think that was a very important start for not only business ethics, but also for businesses as well.
Good. Any other questions? Thank you.
Can I ask you one last one?
Sure.
Just throw it out there. Did you at any stage in your professional career face any animus about expanding Marxist analysis or anything?
Well, I think the opposition, let me say, that I faced in my career wasn't at Tennessee in the philosophy department. We were fairly independent. We could put out the courses we wanted as long as they got enrollment. That was fine. When I came to the business school at Georgetown, that's a very different kettle of fish, okay? And it's not because it's Georgetown, it's because it's a school of business. And so there was much greater skepticism there about business ethics. And even though we had an endowed program, at a certain point that was taken away from us. And from there it went downhill in terms of support until recently, support for business ethics. And still, when I first went to Georgetown, we had 2 courses that related to business ethics. Now we have 1 course that integrates business ethics and management. So that tells you something how the emphasis on business ethics has gone down at Georgetown rather than gone up. And there's a great deal of pressure, of course, from other people in other departments, in finance and other departments, with regard to the significance of business ethics in a school of business. That's something that constantly has to be fought. That's why it's important to be on committees in schools of business and go to meetings in schools of business, because sometimes those issues comes up. And that's another good issue in which you may not be present at a meeting because somebody has excluded you, okay? Or that the topic that you want to have is not raised at that particular point. And so there's a kind of, again, power dynamic going on there that leads to the exclusion of business ethics, recreation of business ethics in different kinds of ways. So the Marx hasn't been a problem for me. I've never been on the barricades of flinging gas bottles and whatever else, even though I've engaged in any number of marches in Washington, D.C. But yeah, the most of the resistance has come, I think, from schools of business trying to integrate that into their curriculum.
I think that's true. So how do you see that in the future? Do you think that business ethics is going to expand in many business schools or contract, or maybe we don't know? What do you think?
I don't know the future of business ethics in business schools. I'd like to see that it expands, of course. I think in part it may do so because those people who are business ethicists coming to the discipline, shall I say, if not the profession today, come from a different background than its founders. All of its founders basically had a background in philosophy. And as other people have noted, business ethics in philosophy is viewed as a distant cousin at best, one that you don't want to get together with very often. And so in our philosophy department at Georgetown, there is not a business ethics course. And so it's been this background of business ethicists having in philosophy that's, I think, shaped a great deal of the development of the society. The society now, I think, is much more with people with a social scientific background or a broader background than perhaps some of the initial business ethicists had. That might be more compatible with some business schools. My concern is to the extent to which it downgrades the ethical aspect of it and becomes much more a practical type of approach to how you should act ethically in a business. I think there's something to be said for looking at the more theoretical backgrounds as well. They can talk about theory in different aspects of business. Well, they can talk about it in business ethics classes as well. But you can't do it the way in which people initially did business ethics, where people come in, well, we're going to have a session on Kant, then we're going to have a session on Mill, and then we're going to have a session on this. And that was much too artificial, and that was that reflected the origins of business ethicists at the outset. And that's understandable. It's much more sophisticated these days. But I think it's also different in that I think it's much more a social scientific background that comes into business ethics, even though a good number of those people have read widely in the ethics and philosophical literature. So interesting also how this is different in different countries. In Germany and France, the Netherlands and the like, I think there's much more kind of philosophical background in those approaches to business ethics, and how that works out in contrast with regard to how it's working out in Anglo-Saxon countries is going to be interesting to follow. That's why this Transatlantic Business Ethics Network that I helped set up is interesting, because we have people from Europe coming together with people from the United States and Canada and sometimes Mexico, getting together, talking about their different approaches and the different types of ways issues they see as being important. And that's an important contribution, I think, to trying to better understand how business ethics might develop in the future.